In a speech to Republican delegates in June of 1858, Senate nominee Abraham Lincoln spoke the words that would foretell the coming war between the states. He said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." These words, spoken nearly 2 years before the first shots were fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina's Charleston Harbor, marking the beginning of the war between the states, would foretell the bloodiest and most divisive time in America's history.
We think of ourselves now as one nation, indivisible, but at that point in time, that wasn't the case. We were sectionalized, both from state-wise. People had more allegiance to their state than they did to a country as a whole. And certainly there were segments of the country, north and south, which had those individual allegiances even stronger. So you had a north, which was industrialized, very strong, industrialized, growing very rapidly, versus the south, which was strongly agricultural at that time. Agricultural, they owned major plantations, and even though slavery was not owned by the majority of whites in the South, all whites participated in the value of it. The value of the goods and services of slavery at that time exceeded today's gross national product. So this was a major issue. And why was all this important? It was extremely important because it was for the control of this country. Who was going to control the country? Which segment, north or south? So all of this came together in the election of 1860 when Lincoln was elected, and it was just, at that point, all bets were off. Who was going to control this country? And we can't do it by compromise. We've tried that in 1850, we've tried, so now it's time, let's go to war. And that's how this whole war got started.
The Fort Pillow Massacre occurred in Tennessee on April 12, 1864. More than 300 African American soldiers were killed, making this one of the most controversial events of the American Civil War. Though most of the Union surrendered and should have been taken as prisoners of war, the soldiers were killed instead. The action originated from Southern outrage at the North's use of African American soldiers. The Battle of Fort Pillow occurred as part of Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest's spring raid into West Tennessee and Kentucky. These areas were being held by Union troops at the time. By the third year of war, the Confederacy was facing severe manpower shortages and scarce supplies. As a result, Forrest conducted the expedition into West Tennessee and Kentucky in an attempt to gain recruits, provisions, and officers for his command. He later decided to move on to Fort Pillow. At the time, it was held by a garrison of around 600 men, half of whom were African American soldiers. During this time, Union General William T. Sherman was gaining forces in Tennessee, in anticipation of his attack on Atlanta against the Confederacy. Forrest and his superiors hoped that his raid would disrupt Sherman's preparations for battle, giving the Confederacy the advantage. The attack was not previously meditated. Forrest was only considering it to gain supplies and ground as the war progressed. By this stage in the conflict, Forrest had already earned a well-known reputation as a fierce and temperamental officer.
The Civil War, the 4 bloodiest years in American history. Most Americans can name at least one major battle that took place: Antietam, Bull Run, and Gettysburg. But among the other smaller forgotten events of the Civil War is the Battle of Fort Pillow. This battle had a domino effect trickling down the long road of history. On April 12, 1864, at a little insignificant fort, black Union soldiers fought a hopeless battle against a Confederate general who was destined to become the first Grand Wizard of the KKK. Today, it is just a footnote in most history books. However, no other event of the Civil War has such a profound impact on the 20th century, especially on our culture and our way of thinking. This conflict would be called the Battle of Fort Pillow.
The invisible fraternity of men who I call the Ku Klux Klan were a necessity of the day. But now, I no longer can embrace their motivation or the lack of morality of these men. War is for fighting, and fighting means killing. That motto got me through the unrested years of the Civil War. I've seen more killing and poverty than should be allowed in a human race. Understand, we are not barbaric. We are people of our time. We've been put in positions to form unions with other Southerners in order to survive. Let me teach you a lesson, and you must learn from our mistakes.
There was no reason for the Confederates to treat black soldiers as prisoners of war. They were to be treated as fugitive slaves. If they did not surrender, they did not stop, they were to be shot down. On the other hand, the black soldiers had no intentions of surrendering for the simple reason that they knew what fate awaited them. The black troops, of course, represented a challenge to the theory of white supremacy. Forrest could not take another setback at the hands of black soldiers. He had to destroy Fort Pillow. He had to destroy the black troops. He had to certainly abuse as many of the white soldiers as he possibly could.
Forrest came over the rampart with a pistol in one hand and his saber in the other and ordered the Union flag to be lowered. In this great chaos, the Confederates began to kill any black soldier that was in eye contact, adding to the carnage.
The slaughter was awful. The poor, deluded Negroes would run up to our men, fall upon their knees, and with uplifted hands scream for mercy. But they were ordered to their feet and shot down. The white men fared but little better. Their fort turned out to be a great slaughter pen. I, with several others, tried to stop the butchery, and at one time had partially succeeded. But General Forrest ordered them shot like dogs, and the carnage continued.
There are conflicting views of what continued to happen the evening of the battle. Union and Confederate sources claim that even though Union troops surrendered and threw down their guns, Forrest's men massacred them in cold blood. Members that survived the Union garrison claim that most of their men disarmed themselves and still were attacked. The Joint Committee on the Conduct of War investigated the incident afterwards and came to the conclusion that the Confederates did, in fact, shoot most of the garrison after the Union had willingly surrendered. This event was not planned by the Confederates. As the struggle for supplies continued, the conflict between the two sides escalated. In heat of battle, the Confederates and all the soldiers made hasty decisions that ultimately ended in a massacre of troops. It also said that racism and personal entity played a factor in the harsh actions against the Union. This is where the debate of racism during the war comes into play. The Fort Pillow Massacre is considered to be one of the most brutal exchanges during the Civil War. The Confederates already saw themselves inferior to African Americans because they were fighting to keep slavery. The debate at hand is whether or not the soldiers were massacred because of the color of their skin. The aftermath of the war became a rallying cry for the Northern abolitionists. It also increased hatred between the North and the South and turned many people neutral on the war against the South, making this the most controversial battle in the Civil War.